Okay, I'm Walt McCarthy. I'll be reviewing in session 23 shelter alternatives. There are a lot of different ways that you can connect shelters to houses if you choose to do that. I don't happen to like that because you're connecting a high pressure structure in the shelters I design. You're connecting a high pressure structure to a house which is a low pressure structure. This structure is very stable being underground. This structure is this part of it is stable. It's underground, but you have a lot of stress on this joint, so there's always a seismic joint here. This is what everybody wants to do. They always want to hook it up to the basement of their house, or hook it up to the house some way. This is a very expensive way to do this, but you can certainly do it. A less expensive way, much less expensive way, is to add a small addition on your house, maybe 10 foot by 10 foot, and you can have the shelter hatch come up in this new addition, which can have windows or whatever you want, um, and you can get into your shelter through your house without going outside. Now, gas masks should only be used to get you somewhere. Um, you can't wear them very long. Even the military, if they're trained, they can wear maybe as long as 8 hours. But for the rest of us, it's a very short period of time. Your face starts to get overheated. If you're older, if you're overweight, if you're a smoker, that all shortens the length of time that you're going to be able to hold that mask on. And they really don't work well for kids. Um, Kids really have a problem with these gas masks. And by the way, whenever you put a gas mask on, especially for children, make sure there's not a block in the that there's not a piece of plastic in the bottom here to seal off the canister until it's used. Just make sure that there's actually air coming in here for the kids. Evacuation, we learned, does not work. This is a prime example of that. September 2008, Hurricane Ike in Texas, all the roads were going out of Houston, all of them. Cars were running out of fuel, cars were breaking down, hotels were full, people can't get out of their vehicles, they can't turn off the exit. This is what we don't want to happen, but it will happen. So this goodie bag thing where you grab your goodie bag and you go, don't follow that. That just doesn't work. Unless you can go off road with an ATV or something, it's just I don't know where you're going to go. So this is something that you can't count on. Well, you can count on it to happen. Don't count on it to get you anywhere. The old civil defense shelters, these are horrible. Of all the standards and principles of protection, this meets none of them. We have the gooseneck, no filter. This is just a hand crank. This is just not the way to do it. There's not enough earth over here or concrete to shield anything. It'll work great if it's 100 miles away from ground zero, because there's no real radiation outside. But there's the amount of radiation that comes into the shelter is lethal. There's not enough space in here. There's not enough headroom in here to stand up. These are just horrible. About 1980, I asked some of the FEMA people, civil defense people, how they managed to come up with a structure like this, because it's even for the standards and the resources that they have, they would know that there's no shielding here. And they said they just didn't have the budget to do anything more. Okay, well, I think they should have said something, but anyway, don't ever use these drawings for anything. Another thing that happens that you can consider are the caveman shelters, the expedient shelters that you build at the time that there's a disaster. It's nothing I get involved in. It's nothing I believe in, but I just don't see too many people going out there, hearing something on the news, going down, digging a 4.5 foot deep hole in the ground and propping this up and then putting 3 feet of earth on here and staying in here for 30 days till the radiation decays. I just don't see that. Public fallout shelters haven't been maintained for over 30 years. They don't have any water. They don't have a toilet. They don't have any food. There's no air. There's no light. This is not something that you want to count on. These signs are still up. There's still a few of them up. They just no longer have a use, and they're usually full of storage, things that they store for the building. But there are basically three types of shelters. Tornado shelters, which are governed by regulation. There's some designs out there: ICC 500, FEMA 320, and by the way, FEMA does not certify anything. They're not a certifying agency. I see a lot of times tornado shelters are FEMA certified. There's no such thing. It can be compliant with the FEMA 320 or compliant with the ICC 500, but neither of them certify shelters. For fallout shelters and blast shelters, there are no regulations. It is an unregulated industry. And it's pretty apparent because there is so much misinformation and so much deception about fallout shelters and blast shelters. It really should have some regulation. And the reason why I got so much help from the government personnel is they wanted a standard out there. So POP has been the Bible in the industry for about 25 years. It's the book that the government should have written. But a fallout shelter is designed for 0 psi. It's not in the blast area. It's gamma shielding only, and it's usually good for life support of about 30 days. The blast shelter is a little more expensive. It's not that much more expensive, and it's usually 0 to 40 psi. 40 psi is usually the limit, even for the military, because above 40 psi you need a seatbelt. If you see these shelters that say they're 200 psi, the shelter may withstand 200 psi. That's pretty questionable, but the shelter may withstand that, but the people can't. Above 40, you need seatbelts. If you don't have that, you're still going to die in the shelter. But blast shelter is designed for gamma and neutron shielding and blast wind and overpressure. And the total rems in shelter from all sources, from the entranceway, from overhead, from the air ducts, is arbitrarily set at 25 rems by the committee. Most of the shelters I do are below 10 rems. And this is, neither of these should be designed for anything less than 30 days. And you should be able to be restocked and resupplied, because you might be going in and out of your blast or fallout shelter for the next year. And here's where some of the problems come in with building permits for underground shelters. Underground shelters just do not fit into the American culture. It just doesn't fit. Steel and fiberglass shelters have no foundations, so they're therefore considered a temporary emergency structure, and they're not covered under city or county guidelines, except places like California where you need a permit to put up a tent. So then it does come under, even as a temporary emergency structure. So you have to be careful about that. The reason that the city officials don't want to issue permits is because they say there's no need for it. There's no threat to the people, and if you do put one in the ground, there might be a threat to the community if it's not properly engineered. And all city officials, here's the real problem, all city officials try to view the underground shelter as an underground house, and therefore it needs windows for egress, for escape. You can't put windows in an underground shelter. It would allow radiation, fire, blast to threaten the shelter. So you just can't do that. It's got to be viewed for what it is. It's an emergency structure. The second problem is that city officials try to apply the national electric codes to the shelter. The small ones are usually a 12-volt power, which is a marine code, and the marine code is not covered in the national electric codes. It's nothing that the city officials have any authority over, so they don't know quite how to handle that. And the other problem is that the permit's open to public inspection. In some cases, they're actually published, and that's bad. One of the things that has happened, probably more than once, but once that I know of, is they did. I had a customer apply for a permit. He got a permit. They said they would issue it as a root cellar. Well, they issued it for an underground shelter. About a week later, he came out to his shelter. Someone had broken in, stole everything out of the shelter because the permit says the address. And so they had a saw. They cut the hinges off the hatch. They stole all the batteries, all the food, the air filtration unit. They stole all the clothing. They stole everything. So you do not want a permit that says underground shelter. The other problem is that if there's a shelter there, and the city knows about it, the U.S. 1978 War Powers Act and the Patriot Act give the local, state, and federal governments the right to commandeer supplies inside that shelter for the benefit of the public good during times of disaster. And they can use limited force. Limited force is a pretty broad term. So that's one reason why you don't want to have that permit. Most personal shelters are installed on a weekend. That's how I usually do it. City officials are closed because they can issue a cease and desist. I've had that happen in California. They can issue a cease and desist, which you do have to follow. But once it's in the ground, they can't issue a cease and desist because you have a right to bear arms, your Second Amendment right, and they're not going to go through the hassle of fighting that unless they can show that there's some threat to the neighbors. But the other thing that they usually argue is, or they used to argue, is that there's no real threat out there for NBC weapons. But in 2006, the Department of Homeland Security issued a national planning scenario establishing biological and chemical and nuclear weapons as a threat to U.S. citizens. So now there is an established, documented threat, and you have a right to protect yourself. And the city just doesn't have the resources to actually do that. So you can get a permit if you have to. Just make sure that it's done properly and probably through an attorney, so you can get the right wording and it's not published that you have this shelter in your yard or somewhere on your property.